Welcome to More Than a Conversation, the podcast where we meet and have discussions with some of the most interesting people and innovative leaders in their fields from all walks of life. We will be discussing everything from politics to theology to religion to philosophy to life. Every once in a while, I may just be on here talking about whatever's in the news and whatever I think will be of interest to you. This is your host, Patrick Connolly, and I hope that today will be more than a conversation for you. Welcome to More Than a Conversation. I am joined today by J. Warner Wallace, and he is a Dateline featured cold case homicide detective. He's a well-known speaker and author. Maybe you've seen him on television. Maybe you've seen him in the movie God's Not Dead 2. Perhaps you've never heard of him before, but he is a leading thinker, author, and all-around warrior for truth in the field of a Christian apologetics, which is the defense of the gospel through reasoned argument and through reasoned discussion. Mr. Wallace, it is great to have you on today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Looking forward to being here.
And I know a lot of your story, and I don't want to tell your story. And so I do know that you came to the faith having not been raised in the faith, having not walked in the faith, but you came to the faith in a very reasoned way. Could you just tell us a little bit about your journey, maybe your upbringing, and kind of what brought you into faith in Jesus?
I was raised here in Southern California, born here, and my parents were, for the most part, irreligious. My dad especially, not somebody who's a believer, not raised in a Christian environment, didn't really have that cultural setting. Even now, I still don't always understand the cultural setting of the church because I didn't have any experience of it. And I was about 35 before I got interested in looking at the New Testament. And by that time, I was working as a detective and had a skill set that wasn't like I was trying to apply this or trying to be creative or I just didn't know any other way to examine a claim, right, than to examine it given that set of skills. And typically you have to be distrusting to do this work well, right, because a lot of this is about you assuming the worst in people until you vet them and you discover, no, this is not your suspect in this case. And so a lot of the skill set that I had as a detective, I applied to the Gospels, especially when it comes to assessing eyewitnesses, because the Gospels are unique in this sense, right, that they claim to be written by people who either saw this stuff or had access to the people who saw, or if nothing else, they are written as though the writer wants us to believe this stuff actually happened. Instead of just being a collection of mythological tales strung together, they are told in a sequential way. And then he did that. And the next morning he did this. And that night he did this. And so there's a sense in which I thought, okay, the skill set I have, you might be able to apply that. Because if you think about it, I spent most of my career working cold cases. They're just unsolved murders because there's no statute of limitations on a murder. So those things stay open. And you sometimes don't get to those for several decades. The more difficult ones I've worked were like in the early 70s. I've had a couple in the 70s. And those are cases that, enough time has gone by that you no longer have access to the eyewitness, that person has died or is unavailable to you. You don't even often have access to the report writer who wrote the supplemental report, maybe the detective who was assigned the case back in the day. So now you're trying to determine what is true about an event in the past when you no longer have access. You have a report, but you don't have access to anybody to ask any additional questions. And that's really what we have with the Gospels. You have access to something that we have a report, but I can't go back and you can't test this by recreating, the scenario. You can't, there's no eyewitnesses you can dig up to talk to you about this. So the skill set that we use when working cold cases, believe it or not, has some application to this. And since it did, that's the way I found myself looking at it. It's that stuff that we call forensic statement analysis. This idea that, and I'm guilty of still using this, right? I'm guilty of still, even today, when I talk to people, you're looking for little deception indicators. You're looking for little ways that people will circumvent the direct response they should give you if they're telling you the truth. You're looking for the way that they extend time or contract time to cover something, or to extend it, to skip it. You're looking for the use of words that are really optional, the things that are your personal choice. About all adjectives and adverbs, for example, those are optional words. You never need to use any of those. But when people do use those, they tell you certain things about what they really mean, what they really believe. And this is stuff, use of pronouns, how we describe people. Do we call them my buddy next door, and Ted? I told you he's my buddy who's named Ted. My next door neighbor, the guy next door, that jerk who lives next to me. I mean, there's lots of different ways to describe the same guy. And as you change the way you use those descriptions over the course of a statement, it can tell you something about what your relationship was at different points in the statement. So this is stuff we look at. And that's the only skill set I had that I could apply. So I started to lean in and use that with the Gospels, not really knowing the structure of Scripture, not really knowing or caring much about the letters that follow the Gospels. I was really concerned about the Gospels and the book of Acts. You give me those things that can tell me something about the historicity of Jesus. That's really where I started. And at about 6 months in, I was pretty convinced that they were reliable to the extent, and again, remember, when we say that something's reliable, we mean that we ought to believe it is telling us the truth about the situation involved. This does not mean that you're going to eliminate every possible doubt that you could have, because we don't ask jurors to do that. We're not trying to prove something beyond a possible doubt. We're trying to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. This doesn't mean you won't have open questions. We tell jurors in advance, can you make a decision? Can you render a verdict even though you might have open questions? They say, I don't know, I'm not sure I can do that. Well, then we just exclude them from the jury. We don't put them on a jury. You don't impanel people, because you'll never have a case in which you don't have significant unanswered questions. Yet you can still render a verdict because you're already beyond a reasonable doubt. And I knew that was where I needed to go, not to this mythical kind of idea that there's no possible doubt, because there's nothing that I believe or know beyond a possible doubt. I can always level some imaginary doubt. So I started off with that construct and applied it to the Gospels. And largely that's not all of it, but that's how you start. That'll get you to believe that. It won't get you to believe in. But again, you don't get to believe in until you go through that thing called believe that. So you have to, for me, take that step first. And that's what I had to do with the Gospels.
It sounds like you're referring to your faith as being something that's quite reasonable. In fact, William Lane Craig speaks of reasonable faith, very well known for coining that phrase, if you will. That being said, prior to you beginning this investigation,
Mm-hmm.
you're living your life in, perhaps it sounds like, not anti-religious, but just that's a world that just wasn't you. You're doing your thing. You're one of the good guys. You're out there catching the bad guys. I know, from what I know of you, that you were multi-generations in police work. So good family, good life, all those things. What actually led you to investigate the Scriptures? Now, we understand the grace of God is working in your life and drawing
Sure.
you to Him, but in that time, does somebody walk up to you and hand you a Bible? Is there that annoying Christian on the police force with you? How did you begin to say, this is something I even want to check out?
No, actually, it was just my love of marriage that got me looking at this to begin with, because my wife was interested in going to church with the kids, and I'm interested in having a great marriage, and so I was more than willing to go with her. I think I know my dad would do that, even though he's a very, I was not anti God unless I was around somebody who was pro God. Then I could become quite a jerk. And so the people who would have known me back then, who were believers, would describe me in one way. Don't start this conversation unless you want me to kick you in the shins. Okay, I'm going to do that if you're going to start this conversation. If you're just going to leave it go, I'm not so over the top that I'm going to bring it up. But if you're going to bring it up, I'm going to knock it down. So that was always my view. But even my dad would go just to be. He believes that these kinds of things, and he's now presently married to somebody who is Mormon. He believes that all of these are equally delusional, but equally beneficial. So they are these these helpful delusions that help you raise good kids and provide some order and structure and meaning to life, and have some practical benefit. Even prayer, he would kind of see it more as a contemplative self-talk that has some practical benefit. And that's, I think, sometimes harder to kind of break through, right? But that was really where I was more than willing to go if she wanted to go. And I would have sat there for years just happily attending as a non-believer. To as an act, you might, like, say, for example, your wife asks you to go to see a romantic comedy, and that's not what you want to see,
right?
But you go, and you might go once a week to see a romantic comedy that you don't want to see. Well, that's kind of how I saw church. But this guy who was there, the pastor who was there, he knew this is his audience often, and he was excellent at provoking people to take another step, provoking people to maybe put that down for a second and just examine this. And he was so relatable that was really the way in. So I'm always careful. We often will, you'll hear within Christendom, complaints about particular kinds of churches that take a particular kind of approach. I'm not really, none of that offends me, because I know God uses all kinds of different approaches for different people.
Sure.
And that doesn't mean he's going to leave me there. Because, I became a believer, and then I became provoked to actually investigate the historic claims of Christianity. And then before long, I'm enrolled in a Baptist seminary. And then after a while, I got a seminary degree, and then I'm planting a church. So, you see this progress occurs. Now, where you start, that little thing that is the first itch that needs to be scratched, that comes to us a lot of different ways. God uses a lot of different people to call his children. So I'm usually less critical about whatever approach is being taken, because of my own experience as somebody who had quite a journey there in the first 5 years that led me all over the place, and then eventually settled down and started actually serving in the local church. And that's really where I came into contact with young people and became so a passion. I guess because, too, I was a father raising young kids. And so you have a father's heart when you're a father, hopefully. And then it's not hard to extend that to strangers. So.
Sure. I've often said there's nothing that's changed me more than my two daughters, and nothing that's taught me more about God and the way he views us, and nothing that's taught me more about the way that I interact with God than my own daughters. So you're absolutely
no
right
doubt.
there.
There is something about that conditioning you're talking about that is absolutely true, which is not to say that God can do whatever God wants to do, but he certainly has used those. I think it'd been a lot harder to convince me of the sovereignty and the love of God in before having my own kids. Not because that drove me to the church in need. I just needed some help raising my kids. No, because that gave me a context in which I could understand, what would I do for my own that God might do for us? So that was helpful. I think there wasn't a mistake that I was 35 and had an experience with good and evil and judgment and overarching ideas, transcendent ideas about what is morally virtuous, what is morally repulsive, an experience as a father from which to draw. Those things were all helpful preconditioners. Now, I will tell you, though, I was absolutely, if you'd asked me, I was not interested. In other words, I didn't have a set of experiences that drove me to a point where I needed God. I didn't sense that anyway in my own life.
Right.
I wasn't trying to clean something up, fix something that was broken, sober up something that was drunk. I wasn't doing any of that. Had a great life. I felt very, very disconnected and self-sufficient when I first stepped in that church. But at the same time, there was something about it that just resonated as true. And when I started reading through the Gospels, they bugged me because they had the flavor of eyewitness accounts that I see in true, reliable eyewitnesses. These things vary. There's a level of variation between a character of variation. I should someday try to sit down and figure out more robustly what that difference is. That'd probably be a good book. But anyway, the point is so a lot of this is intuitive. When you do, for example, when you do forensic statement analysis, this is as much an art as it is a science. And understanding the nature of eyewitnesses is sometimes as much an art as, like, you recognize, it when you know it. When you hear it, you're like going, okay, this dude's a liar. And the more you listen to liars, the more you listen to eyewitnesses, the better you become at spotting the liar. Anyone who's worked in this field will tell you that. And so that was helpful for me to have that skill set first before I started looking at the Gospels.
So as you're doing that, I have this image in my mind, almost going back to the Lee Strobel image, where he's on this pursuit of truth, and he's seeking out source here and a source there, and so on and so forth. As you're going through this, obviously you're reading it, something's resonating where you're going, okay, I thought this was all some sort of bunk, but now it sounds like, it's resonating with you, that truthfulness. Were there sources that you began to seek out?
Okay, so Lee's a good friend, and I will tell you, I'm just reading a book right now. I'm writing another book, and I'm just looking at some of the stuff he's done in a similar area on a book he wrote called A Case for the Real Jesus. It's a great book. And again, it's part of his classic approach as a journalist, right? What do journalists do? They interview, and then they write about their interviews. And that's what he does in all of his books. I am notoriously suspicious of experts. Don't trust anybody. If you're an expert who's written a book about X, I don't care what you have to say about X. Just let me see X. Okay? Just let me see the thing it is you are making an inference about, because I don't trust your inference. Now, this is not something I'm proud of. This is actually something I have to work to struggle to overcome. But it just comes out of a life of working these kinds of investigations where we will use experts in a jury trial in front of a jury. But so will the other side.
Yeah, there's experts that'll say both sides.
Paid than our experts, right? Like our experts are like the county people who we can afford for free under our county budget as a prosecutor. And the defense team is privately funded. And if they got enough money, they can bring in Henry Lee. And now you have Henry Lee versus your crime lab guy, and really, okay, so it doesn't seem like now these experts are talking about the same X, okay? Whatever that thing was recovered from the crime scene. Our experts got an opinion about it. They think you should believe it. We bring that person up, and we'll have to ask this expert. Well, they're going to call an expert, and the expert's going to come up and offer his opinion. And we're going to spend time telling you why this guy's wrong, and they're going to spend time telling you why that guy's wrong. Oh my goodness. Okay, so this goes on forever. So clearly, two educated experts can have two completely different views on the same evidence, and one of them is going to have to be wrong because the two views are in contrast. They're contradictory. So what does that tell you? You have to, as a jury, have to say, okay, look, you go back to that X, and now you can listen to what those experts had to say, but you got to decide after you go back to the X, which one of those experts makes sense in light of what? The X. So I spent a lot of time. This is actually the first Bible I ever bought. I wasn't going to spend a lot of money on a Bible, so I bought this Pew Bible. You've seen it before in pews.
Sure.
Okay, so
buy them by the box sometimes.
Yeah, and so I eventually added these tabs because as I was going through it, I was getting interested in making sure it was tabbed. But then I started using a process called forensic statement analysis. And forensic statement analysis is one of those things where you're just using different colored pens to look at different properties of statements. For example, I told you about compressing time or expanding time, or use of free words like pronoun, pronouns are a choice word. So are adverbs and adjectives. Places where maybe somebody says something that's in contrast to what the other person says. How does it differ? Circling those differences. Can they be blended? All these kinds of things you look at, right? So as I'm going through the Gospel of Mark, this thing starts to look, and I'm just breaking it down into those areas that I'm studying. And I'm doing that for all the Gospels. No matter where you are in my text, you're going to see that it's always, and certain things are certain kinds of comments. So, for example, in Mark, I was examining, because allegedly, according to Papias, the early bishop, says that Mark's Gospel is a memoir of Peter that he creates while with Peter in Rome. Okay, well, that's true. I should see fingerprints from Peter someplace in this, shouldn't I? So as I'm going through, I'm looking for those, what could be, at least need to be investigated as potential insights that either only Peter would know, and that should show up in Mark's Gospel, or they are places where Mark, if he is beloved, Peter is his beloved mentor, might be altering the story just slightly, because he has got a special relationship, and maybe you might see that somewhere. So every time I found something like that, I would just put the little P up here for Peter, because I knew I had to investigate that claim at some point versus the other gospels to see. So anyway, a lot of my time was spent not in the opinions of experts who had examined primary sources, but in the primary sources themselves. So that meant that I had to go out and find all the work of the church fathers and of antiquity and of people who are writing in the first century. And how do we know if that's true? And what's been redacted from that? And blah, 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 blah. And now you're going on forever, right? Trying to do all this. And I'm just reminded now of how many church fathers I was reading, especially as the non-canonicals started to appear historically, because that's one of the things that bugged me early is I didn't realize there were non-canonicals. I didn't realize there were a bunch of second, third, fourth century texts about Jesus that people today, you know, the Dan Browns of the world will say are, you know, somehow telling you something true. But are they? And how would you assess that? Anyway, the point is, that's where I spent most of my time. Instead of speaking or reading experts. Now, I think their experts are incredibly, because if you said, well, look, I don't want to do what you did, Jim. Just tell me what you found. Well, what are you doing? You're trusting somebody who maybe is a couple of feet ahead of you in this area of study. I'm not an expert. I'm just a couple of feet ahead of you. So
Right.
We have a tendency to do that. I think that could be very valuable. But in the end, what I hope the expert does is he or she just points you back to that part of the X that you can go examine for yourself. And that's what I think a good expert does in a jury trial, is he says, you know, now if you look at this aspect of this shell casing, or you look at this aspect of the fingerprint, the way it was moved, or this aspect of the direction of the blood spatter, take a look at it. You're going to see that this is most reasonably, now that the jury can go back at the photos and look at that blood spatter, because he's told them from where he's making the inference. So now you can go back to that picture and say, oh yeah, that I see it now. I can see that. Rather than him just say, well, the blood spatter indicates X. No, show me how you got to that conclusion so I can test it. And that's really kind of so when I did access an expert, I'm looking for that kind of expert who will show me from where that inference is drawn.
One thing I can say is, having seen your Bible, you have let me know how inadequate my own Bible marking has ever been. That's detailed.
Well, and a lot of it too is because it's this obsessive. I would say the first year after attending that church was the most active. Sadly, I was crazy over the top until I got into seminary. In a seminary, kind of, if you've done this, you know that you go into seminary and suddenly you're writing papers for stuff that you actually aren't as interested in.
Right.
And you're doing church organizational stuff, and you got to do 3 preaching classes, and you got to do all this other stuff. And aside from the systematic theology stuff, I was not as interested in some of those other administrative topics. Right.
Yeah.
How to be a good church leader. So I think that's when I really took me a couple of years after seminary to get back into that level of interest again.
Yeah, I used to love the Old Testament until I took Old Testament class, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, then it's part of it too is, this is why I tell people all the time who are interested in apologetics. You and I were talking about the national conference in Charlotte every year that SES puts on, Southern Evangelical Seminary. Great conference, and all kinds of people attend it who are just kind of apologetics geeks like us, right? They're interested in this stuff. And I always want to encourage people. People ask me all the time, well, how can I do what you're doing for a living? Well, I don't do what I'm doing for a living. I have a pension. If I didn't have a pension, I couldn't do any of this. That pays the bills. I'm like you. I'm a person who is interested in serving the church. I'm serving not in a more of a big C way, I hope, than I have been as a little C now that I'm traveling so much. But the point is, you could do this if you could structure your life financially in such a way. You could do this as an avocation, as a hobby, as a passion. And what happens when you go to seminary sometimes is now you're taking this thing your passionate hobby, and you're making it your academic work or your business life. You're paying your bills with it, and suddenly the pressures. There's times you need a vacation from your job. I've never felt like I needed a vacation from any of this, because it doesn't feel like a job to me. And that's why I've always been careful not to turn it into a job, because if it did, I was always afraid, well, then I'm going to need a vacation once in a while. So I just want to be able to do the thing that I'm most passionate about for as long as I can do it.
I think the thing that most stood out to me about apologetics and stands out about people such as yourself, I'll throw back to Lee Strobel again, people who came to the faith from that path. I came, and I've shared some of my story with you, but I came to the faith having been raised in the church, having walked away, and apologetics had a lot to do with me coming back to the church and
Yeah.
back to where I am now. And it's apologetics and this idea of reasonable faith and knowing I didn't have to check my brain at the door to be a believer. That's been great. However,
Yeah.
the other side of that is there's always this question: if you're going to be reasonable, well, how much confirmation bias do I have? I was
Yeah.
raised in it. How much of it is just, I'm just confirming what I've always wanted to be true? And so stories like yours are so powerful because you couldn't get any more objective than where you were. This wasn't something you wanted to be true. It's not something you didn't want
Right.
to be true. It's just something you examined and discovered that, yeah, this is what's reasonable. And I think that's another part too, is we focus, or we allow ourselves as believers to be pigeonholed into the idea that we have to have absolute belief in order to be believers. But I don't believe in the resurrection because it's not possible it didn't happen. I believe because it's the reasonable inference from all the evidence that we have. And that's the reason I believe in God. That's the reason I believe in all those things. You go down the list. I believe in them because they are the reasonable conclusion. And so I feel like we need to change the conversation sometimes when we're speaking with non-believers about what the actual weight of the evidence is. Is that just something that I'm feeling, or is that something that you have seen as well, that it seems like are Christians the only people that have to have absolute proof?
Well, I think that there's a difference between, facts and inferences, and sometimes people conflate those two things. So you'll hear, most reasonably, that the fact of Christianity or the fact of evolution, it's a fact. And of course, all these are inferences from facts. Now, they may be true or they may be false. But to say that it's a fact, no, the facts are the pieces of evidence we find at a crime scene. That so-and-so killed this woman is an inference we make from those facts we see in the crime scene. Now, we can say we have a certain level of certainty about our inference, but let's don't confuse these two things. And so I think what we have are, and by the way, between the facts that you view and the inference that you make, it's not like there's like this direct line. Like we all know the rules of evidence, and we all have that structure set up in our heads. We all know how to make proper inferences evidentially. No, we don't do. We definitely want our jurors to learn that. But we also know that their desires and their past histories and their predispositions and all kinds of other stuff also goes into your inference making. It's not just the facts. And even your wants, it's not like we're not the only ones who want things to be true. I mean, I would say that as a non-Christian, I would have far preferred there to be a world in which really I was my own arbiter of right and wrong. And I didn't feel like I failed if I didn't meet this impossible standard known as Jesus, right? And I'm constantly aware of my failure now, but that was not the case before. In the case before, you might have convinced me I should do something better because in our relationship we have these conditions set, but you couldn't have told me that objectively there's a standard I missed, because there was no objective standard. There were just the agreed upon standards, depending on the kind of context you were in. So I think in the end, we all have to overcome the things we might want or wish were otherwise. And this is not just true for Christian believers or Muslims, or it's true also for atheists. Have to be careful that they don't reject a claim simply because they don't want it to be true. And I think that applies to all of us struggle with that. That's okay. It's part of the human condition, right? So I have a little, I think once and I've heard Bill Craig talk about this a little bit at Reasonable Faith, and he's taken some criticism for it, to argue that, are you certain? Well, I'm reasonably certain. And I think that bothers people when he says that. How could you be able to be reasonable? Well, I think it's because he's not using the language of courtrooms.
Right.
And that's why a lot of times I knew when I came into this project as an apologist that I could probably add something to the conversation, not based on the strength of my intellect or not based on my pedigree, because I don't have any, just based on my experience. I know we use this language in courtrooms for a reason. And we tell jurors that standard of reasonable doubt is all you're ever going to need. And I could say, am I certain that Jesus rose from the grave? Absolutely, to the level of which I am beyond a reasonable doubt. Now that to me is the level of certainty. That is synonymous with certainty. If you think beyond a possible doubt is synonymous with certainty, then you got to say, well, I'm reasonably certain. But in courtrooms, certainty means that you are beyond a reasonable doubt. So if you ask me the question, I can definitely answer it.
Sure.
Now, if you want to mine into that to say, what does that even mean? Well, I can say I have got no reasonable doubts. When you're beyond a reasonable doubt, you have no reasonable doubt. Are there still possible doubts you could level? Are there still imaginary doubts you could level? Yes. But I possess no reasonable doubts. And by the way, don't you want me to be reasonable about this? Okay, then I've already done that. So that's really the standard that I think helps us. And that's why I knew that kind of experience, we talk about epistemology. How do you know what you know? How do you know what is true? And there are, as much as we talk about this philosophically, and I see philosophers debate about this all the time, it turns out there is one practical experimental chamber that we test these theories about epistemology. How do you know what you know? How do you arrive at certainty? How do you know anything? We do this in courtrooms across America every day because we are making long-term judgments about the fate of people on the basis of a level of knowing and understand. We test processes. We test attempts to describe the truth. We then interview jurors after the fact to see how they arrived at that inference, so we can see what we did wrong, what we did right. And we get better and better and better at doing this the more we do them and the more we interview jurors after the fact. And that's the kind of expertise that I was hoping to lean into to kind of help people to realize that sometimes when you're talking to your friends about truth of Christianity, it's not simply the claim. Do I know enough about the claim itself to make the claim accurately? It's first, do I know enough to educate the hearer in the rules of evidence so when I make the claim finally, it won't just fall on deaf ears? And we do not just throw out 6 weeks of evidence to jurors. We also have jury instructions. We teach jurors how to evaluate the evidence so we don't risk spending all that time talking about X just to have them misinterpret it because they were never taught the rules of evidence. Now, what I see in the apologetics project in the church is we spend a lot of time talking about the evidence, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about the rules of evidence that'll make it so much easier once I present the evidence.
Hey, More Than a Conversation listeners, I hope that you are enjoying this conversation as much as I am, and I hope that you're getting something great out of it today. I'm just wanting to jump in here in the middle to take a moment and let you know a few ways that you can help out More Than a Conversation. First, wherever you're listening, please go ahead and click that subscribe button. That will definitely help, and that'll make sure that you get all the content. Also, if you have a way to rate, if your app allows you to give a 4-star, 5-star, whatever the rating is that's the top rating, I would so appreciate if you would go ahead and drop a rating there. That's how the aggregators and the distributors rank podcasts, and the higher the ranking you give, the more ears will be able to hear these great conversations. Thanks again, and I'm hoping that today has been more than a conversation for you. Now let's get back to it. And so one thing that comes to mind when you start talking about that is a concept of circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence is it's a byword, if you will, in the world of legal procedurals. Everybody's watching TV and what happens? Objection, that's circumstantial.
Right.
But I think you have a little different view of what circumstantial evidence really is than the average person.
Right. So, for example, you're right. I mean, sometimes you'll see stuff on TV and maybe it's just not well produced or it's not produced by people who actually know, but you'll never see the objection. I object, that's circumstantial anymore, because there's two forms of evidence. There's direct evidence and indirect evidence. That's it. There's only two ways to present two forms, and these two forms are very specific. Direct evidence is simply eyewitness testimony. So if somebody saw it and can testify that I saw him do it, and he's sitting right there at the end of the table, I can identify him. Okay, great. Now you've got a direct evidence case. If you don't have that witness, and that's all my cases, because if they had a witness, it would have got solved 30 years ago. It's open and unclosed because there was no witness. Then you have to use the other form of evidence, which is indirect evidence. Now, that's also known as circumstantial, but everything other than eyewitness accounts falls in the indirect category. So DNA, indirect. Fingerprints, indirect. Behavior seen, indirect. Words said, indirect. Everything is indirect except for eyewitnesses. That means that the lion's share of cases, and by the way, You don't have a lot of cases with direct evidence in criminal trials, because if you've got a really solid direct evidence case, that dude's taking a plea. That dude's
Right.
taking a deal because he's going to get killed in court. So he's taking a deal early. Now, the people who don't have eyewitnesses against them, they're like going, hey, I could probably beat this. They're going to trial. That means it's those cases that are entirely indirect that dominate court dockets across America. And all of my cases have been entirely indirect, entirely circumstantial. I'll hear people say things like, well, he's got no hard evidence. Okay, there is no such thing as hard evidence. That's not a category. It's direct and indirect. That's it. We don't have a category called hard evidence and soft evidence. I don't know what you would call the opposite. Okay, but the point is we don't have those categories. So when I see people kind of demand certain things that are never used in criminal trials, then you realize, okay, there's the problem. That's where good jury instructions will help. And by the way, one of the jury instructions we have that jurors are offered is that they are to consider direct evidence with the exact same level of integrity and value as they consider indirect evidence. Direct and indirect are no different in the eyes. And they are instructed. There's a jury instruction that judges give juries related to, we never miss that one. We make sure we include that one because our cases are entirely indirect. So right away, if you're going to say it's just indirect evidence or it's just circumstantial, all they have is a circumstantial case. Well, so you can't say that unless you're willing to say all they have is a case full of eyewitnesses. You would never say that. And direct evidence and indirect evidence are to be treated exactly the same. So that is a helpful distinction because it turns out we don't have a direct evidence case for any historical event. If by what you mean by direct is the ability to cross-examine living eyewitnesses. Now, I would suggest that we have a different standard for history anyway, because we cannot cross-examine. That means you could not trust anything that lives beyond the generation that experiences it. That would be stupid. So we're definitely going to have to change that criteria slightly to examine history. It's a little bit different. Why? Because we have a huge high standard in which every accused has the right to react and cross-examine his accuser. And we would rather let 100 guilty people go than falsely accuse and convict one innocent person. So That's why the standard is so high. But you don't have that standard for history, because if you did, you could not speak with certainty about anything outside of the life of your living grandparents. Your great-grandparents, oh no, is anybody alive who can talk about it? No, then you can't trust anything about it. Okay, clearly that standard has to shift when it comes to historical events. But I think we could still test eyewitness accounts the way we have jury instructions for how to test an eyewitness. And those are the instructions that I use to test the Gospels. And so this is, I think, a helpful tool. By the way, the great thing about taking this approach is that there's a good chance that somebody you're talking to in whatever group you're leading or whoever it is you're trying to share the gospel with will at some point either have served in a jury or will someday serve in a jury. And they're going to encounter these rules and they're going to know, hey, this guy was telling me the truth. This guy was that's exactly how we evaluate eyewitnesses. And that's why I think it's helpful for us to use something that's culturally relevant. And we all experience, as adults, we're probably going to experience this at some point if we make it onto a jury panel. That'll help you. And by the way, if we don't make it on a jury panel, you've probably watched enough TV and movies to grab the idea.
I think
this is why, for example, it's harder, especially for young people, where I've got some iconic figure from movies or TV that represents what historians do. It's harder, I think, for young people to be interested if you're going to tell me as a historian. It seems too vague. Now, what we do, we do a bit of forensic history in every investigation, but because we're doing it from the cop angle, I think it gives us an in with a generation that wants to hear, would this pass if your favorite criminal minds investigator, you pick your character, if he was working this case, where would he end up on it? I think that I think gives us a way in, and that's what we're trying to do with these materials, is just help people to say, hey, here's a way in that maybe you didn't have before. And that's what we're trying to provide.
What's interesting is culturally, we have this obsession with television, books, so on and so forth, about preponderance of the evidence. We also are living in a world where I truly believe we're going to begin to see the pendulum swing, because the idea of no truth has become so absurd that even the secular world is saying, hold on a second, there's got to be truth that we can address, and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting to those of you that have not read any of the J. Warner Wallace collection, you start doing that and you start laying out what it is to look at a body of evidence all the way back in Cold Case Christianity.
Yeah.
Now, Cold Case Christianity, tell us a little bit about that and about kind of what's covered in that book.
So cold case is just really examining the Gospels using those criteria that we use in criminal trials. And I really thought, since it's the first book, let me teach you a little bit about the skill set that we use as detectives that will help you, some of the rules of evidence, some of the approaches we take. So we talk about those first, and then we take the 4 criteria for reliable eyewitnesses, and we examine the Gospels under those 4 criteria. Then we also wrote a book called God's Crime Scene, where I give you a template for how we investigate crime scenes that might also be applied to the scene we call the physical material universe, to see if these skill sets you learn over here can help you over there. And then finally, in forensic faith, we just talked about, well, what you discover. And again, my goal, I never set out to write apologetics books, and it just had happened. Part of my journey working with young people, working as a youth pastor, is we started talking about these issues with young people, and it formed and it shaped into books. But what I discovered, speaking around the country with pastors, a lot of times I was being asked to speak at churches where the deacon or the elder was the one who asked me. And luckily that deacon or elder had a relationship with the pastor, and that pastor needed a weekend off anyway. So he was able to kind of twist the pastor's arm in order to get me in the church on a Sunday, which I think it should be. We should take due diligence about who we're going to put on a pulpit. I get that.
Sure.
But once I got there, I realized pretty quickly, this pastor really does not have any interest in making a case for this, making an evidential case for Christianity. I was surprised, actually, at the number of people I met who were church leaders who really had no interest in any of this. So I kind of realized that I had written a book about the case for Christianity, written a book for the case for God's existence. I needed to write a book that was the case for why you ought to make a case. Because it seemed like unless you make that first, you're never going to get to the other 2 cases, especially inside the church. So Forensic Faith is really a book that's more for the church. And it's the kind of book I hope that people will get if they're trying to understand why we should do apologetics and why their pastor should be interested, why anyone in their group should be interested. That's what Forensic Faith does. And so now this last book really is an effort to shift from what is true about the evidence for Christianity, the evidence for God, the evidence for faith, the nature of the word faith. And then even if you knew all that stuff, if you're leading a young group of 17, say 12 to 17, Gen Z, those people who are born from, say, they're 3 to 20 years old right now, that generation that follows the millennials is very different than any other generation. And they are different primarily because of the glowing rectangle, right? This little device has changed a generation. And because what this does is it amplifies change in general. Right. So the level of change that occurs, say 4 generations ago, 5 generations ago, when, for example, we moved from horse-drawn carriages to cars, it took probably 2-3 generations for everyone in the country to have shifted from one mode of transportation to the other, to be able to afford that shift, to have, what does that mean? How does that impact our lives? How does that change the architecture of our homes, of our properties? Do we need to keep horses anymore? How does that change the way we construct roads and lay roads out? We can put things now a lot further apart than we used to. For example, look at all the cities on the East Coast and compare them to Los Angeles. New York is a pre-car city. It is very dense, very high, very vertical public transportation. San Francisco is pre-car. It looks a lot more like the East Coast towns than Los Angeles, which is post-car, which is very suburban, and very rolled out, no specific center. In other words, the technology results in an outcome in the way we live. Well, it turns out this device not only didn't take 3 generations to adopt, it took like 3 years to adopt. Yeah,
the product saturation
amplified the amount of change that occurs in a short period of time. And this generation we're dealing with, Gen Z, is the first native generation that grew up with this from birth till now. They have not known a world in which this device was not part of it. And although you might remember, and maybe your foundation as a man, as a woman, as a family, as a marriage, is pre-phone, is pre-internet technology. That formed your spiritual formation, your thoughtful formation, your social interaction is all formed prior to this. What if all of it began here? would it make a difference in how you see the world? Would it make a difference in how you evaluate information? Would it make a difference in what you trust and what you don't trust? The kinds of relationships you have, the kinds of relationships that have changed altogether. Now, if that's different today, and I believe it is, how do we reach this generation with the Christian worldview? It's a different challenge. And it's different as it would have been prior to any other technological change, only this one happened overnight. So there's a whole generation of people like me, grandparents and maybe some parents, who have not experienced the same world that their kids have. And that's where we thought it's time for us to not do another what is book. What is true about this? What is true about that? We need to do a how-to book. If you knew what was true about Christianity, how would you specifically teach it to Gen Z? And that's what, so the next generation will know, is really built on. Sean McDowell and I really spent time, number one, we both teach at Summit Worldview Conference. We both have youth pastored. He's been a Christian educator in the high school level. We've had tons of interaction. Sean, I think, is still, if he isn't the foremost apologist to young people out there today, I don't know who it is. And I think he's surpassed, except for the kind of international numbers his dad, Josh, sees. Sean is out there. This weekend, he's speaking to 2,300 students. This is the stuff a lot of our audiences are young. I do Rethink conferences with Sean, all young people. We do Summit Worldview Conference in Manitou Springs, Colorado, 150 to 180 high schoolers. You're constantly interacting with young people and listening to how they process information, listening to their questions. And we tried to shape a book that, first of all, identifies them for you, identifies their characteristics that are unique, and then gives you practical ways as a pastor, as a parent, or as a Christian educator to train the next generation.
And that's so important that we do this training. And I want to talk to you a little bit about training. The first thing, though, I want to say this because I know the audience that'll be listening to this by now, maybe if you're not a believer, you've just been intrigued with the concept of, this detective who's come to Christ. But for those of you that are believers that are listening, what is so important to understand is we do not have a generation that is going to accept anything simply because that's the way it is. And that's probably, Jim, talking with you, that's one of the things that I had to deal with the most was getting my congregants who were that baby boomer age to really get a hold of the fact that just because they had been in church, they had been, and again, I'm in the Southeast too, so I'm in the Bible Belt, I'm in, that Charlotte region. We are definitely, we're definitely spoiled here. And what I had to do, though, was get them to understand that their children, their grandchildren, they're not taking things on face value. And apologetics, honestly, to a lot of my congregation over the years has been almost, it's been an apathetic thing to the older folks. It's been something that didn't really matter that much. I believe this since whenever. And almost this, if they just need Jesus in their heart, and then that'll fix everything and everything will be all right. But at the end of the day, working in a Christian school and dealing with young people as a youth pastor and as a pastor, I really don't think, and that's why I think forensic faith is so important. I think there's entire generations in our church that aren't really grasping the way that young people think and the access to information that they have and so on and so forth. The pulpit has lost its initiative. The church has lost that. We are no longer the voice that we once were. There was a time you went to church, you had these segments in society, you went to church and the church told you something and you said, okay, well, the church told me that, so I'll take that as gospel, or I'll take that as the truth and we'll move on. Well, now every Sunday when I step into the pulpit, I am competing for brain space, if you will. I'm competing for legitimacy with all the other sources that are out there. And they're Googling me when I speak. If I tell a statistic or a story, it had better be correct. And so I think that perhaps this book will be a big help, especially Forensic Faith, in educating those that are in the church about the dangers of what's happening with the generations that are coming along, that we really have to deal intellectually with Christianity. That being said, you just used the word training. Now, I know that training is something that sticks out. In fact, in Forensic Faith, you talked about your training with the SWAT team and the training that went on there. It feels like we teach a lot of facts, and yet I'll give you an example. I received a phone call not long ago from a pastor who says, listen, and he's an apologetics minded pastor, and he knew I was as well. And he says, listen, I've got a young person from my church who has come to a university in your city. And when they came to the university, they're 2 weeks into their freshman year, and they've called me up weeping because they don't know what they believe. And their entire worldview, literally 2 weeks into freshman year, completely shaken. And that's happening again and again and again. So we're teaching our kids. We're sending, we've got youth pastors that are trained and have been to seminary and have taken our denominational courses and all those things. And our pastors are trained or are taught, and we're teaching. We've got facts and figures. What are we missing in instructing our young people?
I had the same experience as a youth pastor too. The first year I adopted the group that I had. I think it probably happened just as fast as it did for this guy. I just didn't hear about it until Thanksgiving break. But by Thanksgiving break, these seniors that we had graduated were no longer Christians. At least that's what they said. And I realized that we do have a problem, right? So you're right also that there's, I think as humans, when we hear something that makes sense to us, we are inclined to adopt it. The problem is that your pastor is no longer the only person who's making claims that might make sense. Everyone's making claims that might make sense. So what we discovered statistically is that Gen Z are the least trusting. They're not likely to trust. Too many options. The more options you have, the higher the level of distrust, not the lower the level. So that's something we had to kind of work on, right? But training is something that we have to do in California just to retain our certification, right? So if you don't train consistently, and sadly, sometimes not sadly, in a good way, you're not doing anything new. It's not like I would go to a training day and learn sometimes you do. But a lot of times you just simply do is refreshing the old thing you've known, but maybe you've gotten sloppy at it or lazy at it, right? You're just kind of returning back to that level that you started with. But we train consistently because we know tomorrow we're going to have to apply that training. So we have defensive tactics training probably once a year. We have to shoot in the range once a month. We have pursuit driving every other year. This is stuff we do because we know that in the next shift, sadly, there's a possibility that number one, you're probably going to light your lights up and you might get involved in a pursuit. You're probably going to put your hands on somebody, especially if a scuffle occurs. You would have to use your weapon. You better be ready to go on all these things. And because we have a sense of the imminent calendared threat, because we know we have to work on Thursday night, that's probably when we're going to have to apply what we learned today. It's Monday, but on Thursday night, I might be actually applying what I learned today. That changes the intensity of what you learned today. So now I'm paying attention, right? Because number one, a lot of it too is that you're in a setting in training in which your peers are there with you, watching how well you do relative to them. And you all know that you have this thing called your next shift when you're going to probably have to apply what you just learned. So that sense of having an impending calendared challenge that's real changes the way I start to think about what's being taught to me. It turns teaching into training. And this is what we try to do with young people, is we put something on the calendar that forces them to exercise this thing we just taught them. Could you imagine if your kids went to school and they took an algebra class and the teacher first day says, look, I'm going to teach you all kinds of cool stuff, but I'm not going to take tests. Okay, I don't believe in tests. So I'm just trusting you to pay attention and to learn this stuff because it's pretty cool. Really? Okay. You might even say, hey, it's not only pretty cool, but actually if you learn it really well, you can get other jobs, you can do your checkbook better, blah, 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 blah. You might even give me reasons why I should learn it, but I'm never going to test me. You're not going to have a test on Friday? Trust me, other aspects of life are going to test you. And I'm just going to spend the time on those tests, studying for those tests. How much time am I really going to spend when there's no test coming, preparing for this material? Probably not much. Well, as the church, we never test our kids in a way that is powerful, that would cause them to have to study. So we decided to shift toward a model in youth ministry that would replace the kind of fun not esoteric, but kind of meaningless fun trips you might do. It used to be we would go to a surf camp, and they would surf we'd do a morning devotional. They'd surf all day, and then we'd do an evening devotional. Well, in the morning devotional, they just can't wait to get in the water. And the evening devotional, they're tapped out. So how much are we really doing there to advance? And by the way, we're just kind of like showing them that their Christian life is this thing you wedge in sideways when you're not doing the stuff you really want to do. That's kind of what we affirm over and over again in these camps.
Ouch.
So what we try to do instead is to say, no, we're going to replace those with missions trips that are going to be more exhilarating and meaningful than anything else you've ever done or anything you will probably ever do from this point on. And we have heard that repeatedly from our students who will say, those things you did, those trips that were training trips, really, we calendared something. If we had three, we'll talk about this in the book. Tab training is theology, apologetics, behavior. Theology, apologetics, behavior. And we teach those three things in youth group in series of instruction. We'll talk about it in the book. But we also take training trips, theological trips, apologetics trips, and behavior trips that test what we've been teaching. So if we're taking a theology trip, we would take our kids to the heart of Salt Lake City at the temple, where there's a whole other religious worldview theologically that's very robust, and those people see us as the lost people group. That's a great place to interact. If you don't know something about what they believe and what you believe, good luck interacting there. So we would train for 8 weeks before we would go. We would go for 6 days of saturation, where these kids are going to be saturated with discussing Christian worldview to Christian missionaries on this campus at BYU, door to door in the city of Provo, at pageants for the Mormon Church, on the temple grounds, everywhere we could go. We would just saturate our kids, and they would come back each night feeling exhilarated, but like, dang, I couldn't make my point. They didn't understand what I was saying. Now they're studying again all night. So the 8 weeks before we would go would be robust training. You could only miss 1 or 2 sessions. You had to pass the tests, read the books before you could go on the trip. And then when you went on the trip, there was not a kid who went on any of those trips who didn't immediately sign up for the next trip. I was really shocked at that. I wasn't sure what to make of it when I first started. I just knew I felt compelled to do it. But when I saw how kids were excited about it, I said, wow, okay, we're on to something here. We can probably start replacing more trips and take different kinds of missions trips. And we did that. So these tab missions trips were really the ones that changed our youth ministry. And it showed young people, especially the ones we took to Berkeley. UC Berkeley is a great place to go if you want to teach apologetics, because those kids up there are not necessarily are believers. They have atheist teachers come in, atheist professors come in. They would be interacting with these folks, and oh my gosh, it would be pretty dynamic, and sometimes it could be pretty energetic, and sometimes not always positive. And a lot of it was something, I'll tell you. And afterwards, those kids were ready. They had not heard a single objection to Christianity that they hadn't already researched, been in dialogue with non-believers on. So when they got to their freshman year in college, they might have gone on 2 of those trips before they ever got there. So they weren't going to hear anything new there in terms of objections to Christianity. They'd already covered all that and had been acting as the Christian apologist on 2 missions trips before they got to college. Now, does not mean that still some young people will say, I'm out of here. But it's not because it's a rational reason. Those same kids 2 years ago were on the street defending Christianity. This has to do with the condition of the heart or the will. That's fine.
Sure.
But I just wanted to make sure, and I used to always say, hey, if you're going to walk away from Christianity because you don't think you want to live that way because you're in rebellion, that's fine. I was 35 years before I was a Christian, so I got no problem with that. That's on you. But if you don't want to believe it's true because you don't think there's enough evidence for that, well, then now that's on me. So I just knew that once I did my job, now it's on you. So I was okay with that. And that's just the kind of the cop in me anyway. So I think part of this is figuring out how to calendar a challenge that turns your teaching into training, because they are now training. Like boxers train for fights, gymnasts train for events. Soccer, we had the women's soccer, FIFA. Okay, they train for weeks and weeks and months, and they form a team from all the professional teams, and then they train for a period of time specifically for World Cup. They know there's a calendar date that puts a sense of urgency to get this ready, so they take the field together.
A date, a place, a time.
In the training.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's amazing to me, or appalling, I guess would be a better word, is that we've just kind of, okay, well, that's what happens. They grow up and they go away, and now we're at this point where maybe 30% are returning whenever they have kids, and it's just become something we accepted. But this, and in fact, I don't even want to ask you any more about the specifics, because I want everybody to go out and buy the book. That's incredible. Let me ask you this. Will there ever be a time where there is a cold case Christianity comprehensive curriculum for a youth group? So, for example, I love apologetics. I'm working to train my leaders in apologetics and towards that goal. Not everyone has that same passion.
Right.
And it's also something that, I mean, anybody that wants to learn apologetics can learn. You can be a self-starter, and the books are out there, and you can learn the information. Again, it's training, it's practice. There's only so many objections, and a lot of the objections, and you know this, I'm not telling you anything, a lot of the objections we hear are just variations on the same arguments. And so it's not the most difficult thing in the world. You don't have to be the most intelligent person in the world to learn the arguments. However, not everyone's got that interest. Not everyone knows where to begin. Will there ever be a time where we can buy a binder or whatever from you, a field training manual, if you will, where it'll lay out, these are the facts, and then this is how you apply them. Week 1, do this. Maybe it's a 40-week, maybe it's a 52-week, maybe whatever, where we can take youth groups through something like that.
Yeah, I think, yes, there will be. As a matter of fact, I just wrote the first trilogy of books, which was Cold Case Christianity and God's Crime Scene and Forensic Faith. And then I wrote this book with Sean, which is really a how-to book. And now I'm just starting a second trilogy of books with Zondervan. And this is one of that trilogy. So yes, there will be something specifically that really seeks to teach detective principles that I actually have employed solving crimes. To help young people think critically. But I will say this to you, and I'll just finish with this. So part of what I think is important for us to do as a church is to understand that we can raise the bar. And I know you're doing that already. And a part of this is demanding more of our students. Do you realize the textbooks, some of these books I've got behind me here are books that I purchased to see what it is we were teaching our young people in high school. You'd be surprised at the level that we ask kids to examine physics, for example, at the high school level. It's pretty, for most of us as adults, if we had to go back and read a physics class, maybe a junior year or a senior year physics class, you might find that to be a bit of a challenge now.
Right.
But as we ask our kids to do this in physics, I mean, we've got AP classes, international baccalaureate classes that are raised, advanced placement classes for college. We ask our juniors to take that level. There's kids who can go all the way through calculus in high school. I did. Now, I will tell you that we have raised the bar for young people in high school on almost every level except for theological levels. In youth group, we're not raising the bar. So when I wrote Cold Case, I was with Sean McDowell, and we were training kids to go to one of our Berkeley trips. We're at Berkeley, and we're talking about the reliability of Scripture, and I'm doing it on the wall with the students, and Sean says, you should write a book about that. Well, that's what became Cold Case Christianity. We were teaching that material to juniors. Now, I think it's accessible, but you're right. I think what it comes down to is it's why I wrote the how-to book, because it's not like, do I know all this data? I got that. Now the question is, how do I parse it out for students over a long period of time? And that is the challenge. And I recognize that challenge. And that is the focus of one of these 3 books we're doing with Zondervan. Because I know that that's something that we've got adult books, say adult, but I think they're good enough for high school as well.
Sure.
But okay, fine, those are adult books. We've got now curriculum for all 3 books. We've got 8-part video curriculum for all 3 books. A Cold Case, A God's Crime Scene comes out next month, the video curriculum for that. But we've also got kids' books. Same 3 books for kids at casemakersacademy.com. That's for 8 to 12-year-olds. But now the question is, what do we have for high schoolers specifically? And I get that, and I want to be able to scratch that itch. So that's something we're working on.
And in all reality, I can say, as a person who worked with high schoolers in the school setting as well as a youth pastor, the books that you have are accessible for a high schooler. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing what you have in the future.
No, I appreciate it, brother.
Now, let me ask you this, before we let you go, where can people follow you? Where I know you're always putting out things. I follow you on social media. you've got articles, you've got interesting things that maybe you didn't write them, but you're sharing them, a plethora of knowledge. Where can folks follow you?
Well, you can follow me at coldcasechristianity.com. That's really my home base for everything. And you'll see the links to all my social media there. But we are in a social media world. And I think even at my age, I'm 58, right? I was an early adopter of social media, and I plan on staying engaged in whatever form. I try every new platform that comes out there to see what might effectively work to communicate ideas. But I try to follow about 700 bloggers in this realm of Christian case making. And that's the content that I push out through my social media, especially Twitter and Facebook. So you'll find me on all those platforms. If you follow me, I hope to be like the Drudge Report of Christian apologetics, right? The one stop you can go to see what everyone, and I want to elevate all those. I used to say it all the time that we don't need another $1 million apologist in the church. We need $1 million $1 apologist in the church. And there are $1 million $1 apologists out there, just folks like me who are they've got a career in something else and they love the Lord and they want to serve him by making a case for him. And they've started a little blog on WordPress. Well, I find those people or they email me. And then I start to tweet out on my social media platform what they're writing. My hope is that eventually we're going to build their audience so they'll have their own social media platform, because trust me, this is happening in the secular world. This is happening all the time in the secular world. There's a certain amount of synergy that's occurring over there that we need to copy so that we cannot run from. I mean, I see all the time people will say, oh, I'm so over Twitter. I'm now on this thing called Parler. Really, okay, look, if the world is over there that you disagree with, that's where we need to be. Doesn't mean you have to get beat up over there. Manage your social media well. But it does mean we should be present over there, because that's where the conversation is occurring. So that's why. But if you'll just go over to coldcasechristianity.com, you'll see links for all that stuff over there.
Coldcasechristianity.com. And I cannot say enough for all of the books. I've read almost all of them. I am getting ready to get into So the Next Generation Will Know. And I'm looking forward to that. But let me just give my personal advice to everyone out there. Get these books. You'll enjoy them. They're great reads. They're well written. They're interesting. They're fun. They're enjoyable. So turn off Criminal Minds. Get your very own personalized story, and learn some great information about the faith as well. And that's the thing. I love that quote. Let's make $1 million $1 apologists out there. But thank you so much, Jim Wallace, J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for coming on today. Anything else you'd like to leave us with?
No, I appreciate you. This is one, if we keep on doing these, all of us are doing our best to contribute to this larger conversation. Thanks for including me.
Thanks again for being part of More Than a Conversation today. If you'd like more content like this, check out my blog at www.pastorconley.com. That's PastorConley.com. Again, that's PastorConley.com. I'd also love to see you join us in worship at Garden Sanctuary. If you're ever in Rock Hill, South Carolina, or the greater Charlotte area, we'd love to have you stop by and worship with us. Check us out at www.gardensanctuary.org. That's gardensanctuary.org. Until next time, I hope this has been more than a conversation.